Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to our program, Unveiling DEI, examining its true impact on higher education. Please welcome Madison Marino, Senior Research Associate in the Heritage Foundation Center for Education Policy.
Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Heritage Foundation. I'd like to extend a warm welcome to those of you in the audience and to those of you joining us online. We are pleased to have you with us for today's event, held in collaboration with the National Association of Scholars, where we will examine the true impact that diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives are having on higher education. It is well known that higher education is grappling with a significant DEI problem. Research conducted by my colleague at the Heritage Foundation, Jay Green, has revealed that the average U.S. college now employs 45 DEI officials, a number that continues to grow. The profound influence DEI on higher education has also been associated with the increasing politicization of state universities and the escalation of tuition cost. As students return to colleges and universities this fall, it is important to recognize that the efforts of DEI offices are not without consequences. Even in light of recent developments, such as the Supreme Court's ruling prohibiting the use of racial preferences in college and university admissions, many institutions have chosen to double down on their commitment to DEI initiatives. For instance, our legal experts here at the Heritage Foundation have recently highlighted the University of Michigan's ambitious plan to expand its DEI program. This expansion includes increasing the number of DEI employees from 142 to 500 employees, with the DEI payroll rising from 18 million to 30 million. Similarly, Princeton University has recently issued a report celebrating the growths of its DEI programs, grants, lectures, series, and administrative positions. Given these developments, we may soon witness a resurgence of campus protests driven by the DEI office and other officials who, under the guise of addressing issues of race, ethnicity, gender, and more, are dangerously exacerbating divisions among students. Today, we are honored to have with us Teresa Manning, the Policy Director for the National Association of Scholars and President of the Virginia Association of Scholars. She will lead a discussion with other experts. We have George Lanoux. He is the Professor Emeritus and Research Professor of Public Policy and Political Science at the University of Maryland, the Baltimore County. We also have Jay Green. He's a Senior Research Fellow here at the Heritage Foundation. Scott Yenner, he's a Professor of Political Science at Boise State University and also a Washington Fellow at the Claremont Institute. And then lastly, Mr. Ken Cuccinelli, the former Attorney General of Virginia, will be joining us. Please join me in extending a warm welcome to Teresa and other experts.
Thank you so much, Madison, for that nice introduction, and it is truly a privilege to be here at the Heritage Foundation and with all of these accomplished speakers. Again, my name is Teresa Manning. I am the Policy Director at the National Association of Scholars and the President of the Virginia affiliate of the National Association of Scholars, the Virginia Association of Scholars. Most relevant, we produced a report on diversity spending at Virginia State Universities last year. The report is not with me today, but we did bring a one-pager which highlights the main fact findings of that report. I hope everyone was able to take one of those pages because it distills the message of the report on diversity spending. But really, today's event is in large part because of the Maryland affiliate of the National Association of Scholars. We have George Lanoux here, who is the president of the Maryland affiliate, which just this summer produced its diversity report, focusing on the diversity programs at the state universities in Maryland and whether those diversity programs comport with recent Supreme Court jurisprudence, as Madison pointed out, the Students for Fair Admissions case against Harvard and the University of North Carolina. We also have Jay Green, of course, the Heritage Senior Fellow at the Education Center and author of countless reports as well, but most relevant was the report he authored with Mike Gonzalez on the dangerous diversity ideology at Virginia state schools. So Virginia is well represented, finding that Virginia is a standout, unfortunately, in terms of the ratio of DEI employees to tenured faculty. And even more surprising, that George Mason University was singled out as having the greatest ratio of all the Virginia state schools. We also have Scott Yaynor, second to the last there, who is really what my kids would call the original gangster for state-level diversity reports. He is the one that began this trend with a very detailed report from his home state of Idaho, and then participated and authored the reports from North Carolina, Maine, and Tennessee. And then at the end, of course, we have Ken Cuccinelli, who is the former Attorney General of Virginia. We're so pleased to have you, Ken, because we do a lot of this work building a case that something is wrong in American higher education, and maybe not just wrong, but also illegal. And we would like these findings to be called to the attention of high-level state officials, including legal officials such as the state attorney general. Now, before we open it up for the panel discussion, I'd like to make a few remarks just to get them out of the way, because I think that certain things should be cleared up and probably apply to everyone's remarks, sort of umbrella issues. And the first is a note on language. So this event has been billed as an Unveiling diversity event, but actually the diversity phenomenon goes by many names, but it is always the same substance. So for example, Scott Yaynor's report, I think, called it social justice. You could also say affirmative action, quotas, racial preferences, anti-racism, critical race theory. All of these names point to destructive ideologies that demand institutions recruit based on race, ethnicity, and sexual identity instead of based on merit and talent. So whatever the name, we are talking about the same phenomenon. This has gotten so pervasive and such a top priority for so many officials in academia and also in corporate America. It, in my view, is approximating a state religion. And it is also displacing the character of America as the land of opportunity for individuals and becoming instead a nation of identity, very poisonous, toxic identity politics. Obviously, in my view, any 1 cent spent on a destructive ideology that pits Americans against each other based on race or sex or ethnicity is too much money. So we will probably discuss how the expenditures have exploded in recent years, but the principle is that all of this spending is displacing real education. So with that, let's start with Scott Yaynor, since Scott really was the one to begin this trend of producing state-level reports documenting diversity ideology at state universities. Scott, could you share with us the main takeaways of the reports that you have authored, what prompted them, what you would like the audience to go away with? We hope they'll read the reports, but if not, the main takes.
Yeah, well, thanks for having me here. My experience as a college professor when I began in 2000 was that most of the problems with the destructive ideologies came from the bottom up, the corruption of various departments, sociology, English, history, these departments. I didn't get into the line of into that line of work to become a sociologist or historian because I thought those disciplines were pretty corrupt. And over the course of my 20-plus years on the university, the trend became that the corruption was coming from the top down as well. And I was a particular victim of this, if you want to think of it like that. I went through a couple cancellations at my university, and I started to wonder, like, where did this guy come from who was going after me? He was the diversity and inclusion coordinator. He was hired, and a month later, I was under investigation for writing a pretty innocuous piece, actually, for the Daily Signal on transgenderism back in 2015. And so I started kind of just digging up where this came from. And I found a strategic plan of the university that had a section on promoting diversity, equity, inclusion, which, you know, this was 2017 when it happened or so. And then all of a sudden, I read that, and all of the parts of that plan I could see happening in requirements on syllabus and in offices being established on the university and other policies being adopted. And I was kind of very interested in that, that it was an effort to transform the university from above, and it was happening kind of in real time. And so we got together with an interest group in Idaho, and we wrote just a report on what the strategic plan was, and then how it was manifesting itself in practice. And then we did it for the University of Idaho, and the legislature was interested in this. And because this was a very ethical document, it was like trying to transform the ethos of the university and of departments that weren't, like, that were maintaining their own professional standards. And when we released this and had some success in the legislature amending the practices of the university, other interest groups started to call up, and they're like, well, can you do that for us? And the main thing to us wasn't the spending, because if the spending was worthy, we wouldn't mind it being spent, the money being spent. The main thing was the ethical transformation of the university, and they were happy about what they were doing. They were always advertising what they were doing. It was included in their strategic plans. And the strategic plans were a roadmap to the transformation of the university. You could tick the boxes on the strategic plan of what they would accomplish over the course of time. And so the backbone or the spine of all of the state reports that I've done, and I think I've done about 15, sometimes just on one particular university, but the spine has always been, what is the strategic plan, and where has it manifested itself up to this point in the transformation of universities? In my opinion, my magnum opus on this, my War and Peace, is the report done on Texas A&M, which was about a 70-page report. Nice executive summary, though, that just follows 3 strategic plans from 2010, 2014, and 2020. If you did a strategic plan in 2020, it ended up being bonkers, but also implemented with a fanaticism that could be easily traced and documented. And when you follow the strategic plan, you're led to the money, you're led to the personnel, but you're also led to this ethical transformation of the university. And so my counsel to anyone who's interested in doing this is follow not the money, follow the strategic plan to see this ethical transformation.
Wow, so Scott, you have authored more than just the few reports that I mentioned.
Oh, yeah.
All right, well, good for you. I think that raises the issue that this really isn't limited to any particular state. This is a nationwide problem. This is a problem in state universities throughout the country, and also private universities, and probably also private schools. That's an interesting characterization in ethical transformation, sort of like what I was saying about a religion substitute, a quasi-religion. It really has become top priorities. So Jay Green, for the report that you authored on the Virginia State Schools, the Virginia affiliate of the National Association of Scholars focused on money. Should Virginians be paying for university diversity leftism? But Jay, you and Mike Gonzalez took a different approach where you focused on the ratio of DEI bureaucrats to faculty members, finding George Mason University a standout. Do you want to talk a little bit about that?
Sure. So the Virginia report that I wrote with Mike was actually an extension of a national report that I did with James Paul, where we just counted DEI bureaucrats. Now, as you correctly said, DEI means lots of different things, and there are a lot of different words that can be used to substitute for DEI. But here we're focused on a bureaucracy at universities with the main purpose of promoting a set of values. That is, they are not engaged in the traditional functions of teaching or research. There are people at universities who are doing DEI-related research or teaching. They're in ethnic or gender or sexual identity departments, right? We're not counting any of those people. We're just counting bureaucrats who hold administrative positions to articulate and enforce this ideology that we're talking about. And as you correctly pointed out, this is an ideology that is a significant departure from a traditional academic and American ideal of treating people as individuals equally under the law, but instead treating people as members of groups and treating them differently based on their group identity, with oppressors deserving rough treatment, being stripped of their privilege, while the oppressed are deserving of restitution for collective or historic wrongs. So the bureaucracy at these universities to enforce that ideology, they have offices, and you can count them, and they've metastasized and grown over the years. And we just counted them at 65 universities that were members of the Power 5 athletic conferences at the time. Those conferences are now gone. But since the athletic conferences are the most important things, that's how we identified those 65. And then we extended that report in the one you're describing to Virginia. And we were particularly interested in Virginia because Virginia is a purple state and has George Mason University, which is kind of thought of by conservatives as a safe place for conservative ideas. And it is in tiny islands, in its law school, in its econ department, but these are embattled little islands that are barely able to maintain their shores. That's not what what George Mason looks like as a whole, and that's not what Virginia universities look like as a whole, despite the purplish nature of the state. So we found that Virginia had, the public universities we looked at in Virginia have much larger DEI bureaucracies than other states, where you would think of them as deep blue states where there should be larger bureaucracies, but no, Virginia has bigger. And George Mason has only short of Syracuse University was the only other university in the country that we looked at that has a larger bureaucracy as measured by the number of DEI bureaucrats relative to tenured or tenure-track faculty. And the ratio was 7.4. So there are 7.4 DEI bureaucrats or DEI administrative positions at George Mason relative to every 100 tenure-track or tenured faculty. So it's almost, one for every 12, basically faculty members going to have his or her own DEI bureaucrat.
So disappointing.
Right.
And such a drain on resources that could otherwise be spent for real instruction. It's no coincidence that high school and college graduates are surveyed as more and more ignorant about American civics, about world geopolitical matters, because so much of the university is now being devoted to this destructive ideology. It's really displacing real learning. In the Virginia report, I mentioned in September 2021, orientation materials at James Madison University in Harrisonburg, orientation materials now, listed as oppressors, Christians, white males, Western Europeans, and Americans. So this diversity ideology is turning young people against their country and against, I think, their Western civilization as a whole. I started with a note on language. I think the word ideology is also interesting and important. It's a relatively modern term, which is to say the ancient world didn't talk about ideologies. Instead, ancient terms are things like philosophy, an ancient word like tyranny. Ideology is so a modern term that technically means the study of ideas or thought systems. But note that that doesn't check those ideas against a reality. So ideologies, I think it's important when we use that term that these are imposed ways of thinking where the reality check does not exist. It's not like the word philosophy, which means the love of wisdom, which presumes a reality out there to understand and respect. Instead, the modern age is preoccupied with ideologies or thought systems with no check on whether those thought systems are right and wrong, good and bad, real or unreal. So a product of the modern age. Thank you, Jay. George, now we'll turn to you, main author or one author of the Maryland affiliate of the National Association of Scholars report, which looked at the diversity reports from the state schools in Maryland and asks if those diversity programs comport with the United States Supreme Court most recent opinion on racial preferences and race-based practices generally, the Students for Fair Admissions case. Do you want to share the takeaways of your report, the main points you'd like people to maintain?
Thank you, and thank you to Heritage for sponsoring this. The NAS Maryland affiliate looked at the reports, the annual 2023 reports filed by 12 USM institutions, the public institutions. And we believe that they raise two kinds of legal issues. One is compelled free speech, and the second is equal protection. Particularly after the Supreme Court's decision in SFFA, which declared, quote, outright racial balancing is patently unconstitutional, end of quote, and in which the court vigorously criticized the idea that if you know a person's race, you can then generalize about what they believe in and what their backgrounds are. Then the assumptions in the DEI programs in the public universities in the state of Maryland are inconsistent with that decision. Let me tell you, I think there's been a one-page handout of some materials, and I have a few copies of the full report. It's 47 pages. If you want to get it and you don't have, you can't get one of the copies I have, see me and I'll give you my card and you can email me to get it. But these are the four things that we found were characteristic of the DEI programs at Maryland's public institutions. One is required DEI affirmations in job searches and in employment evaluations, and in some cases in research grants. DEI does not value intellectual or political diversity, and when DEI is part of a job ad, it effectively deters non-progressive candidates from applying. And when it is a part of the interview process, it can be used to eliminate those who do not subscribe to the search committee's prevailing ideologies. So that's a very serious issue. It shapes the characteristics of faculties and now has created a system that's going to be very difficult to uproot. The second thing we found is targeted recruitment and identity reinforcement of students and employees of their racial and ethnic identities. Many campuses have orientation programs or other kinds of required programs in which the racial and ethnic identity of people becomes the primary way they're characterized on the campus. Third, space and budget allocations for some racial and ethnic groups, but not others. Campuses sponsor faculty, staff, alumni groups based on ethnicity and race. Some groups are officially sponsored and recognized, and that can have a significant impact on campus politics. When you have a faculty group organized by race, or say an alumni group organized by race for some races but not others, then in campus politics they have a voice, other groups don't. Fourth thing, campus-sponsored celebrations such as graduation ceremonies for some selected racial and ethnic and gender orientation groups. Now, students and faculty have a First Amendment right to form groups, but when the campus policy creates a political legitimacy for some groups identified by race, but not others, then there's an equal protection problem. All of these concepts reinforce the idea that the campus views individuals as representatives of racial and ethnic groups who should be treated, promoted, celebrated, and protected differently. None of this happens because the campuses have identified any particular problem of racial discrimination that's current. One of the interesting things reading the reports is that's not a part of any of the reports. We had this incident, we have these statistics. We know there's a discrimination problem. Our DEI program is aimed at correcting it. That's not what this is about. What it's about is a generalized view of past American society and DEI's idealized view of proportional representation. Now, I hope some of you have had access to the one-page handout which summarizes what the Maryland affiliate is asking our board and our state attorney general to do. We want them to have a single definition of the concept of representation. We want them to define protected and unprotected speech according to the First Amendment and disperse those definitions. We want them to encourage intellectual diversity and academic freedom. We want them to avoid any form of compelled political or ideology as a condition for admissions, employment, or financial rewards. And we want, and this is key, the legal advice by Maryland public officials complying with SFFA to be made public. We have inquired of the State Attorney General's office for what's being told to campuses about how they have to comply with this decision. And our response so far is it's all privileged. We can't get access to it. We've pointed out that in the past, the precedent is on many issues, the State Attorney General's office policy recommendations are quite public. They want them to be public. But on this issue, they're telling us they're privileged. So one of the most important things I hope can be garnered from this session is that maybe Heritage, maybe NAS, maybe some other institutions can combined or individually take steps to find out what state attorney generals have told their campuses in the various states across the country, and also trustee boards. Because we're going to find out that it varies enormously, that some states have seen SFFA and other legal requirements as binding on their campuses and have taken actions. Other states haven't done anything, and some states, like Maryland, probably have done something but are keeping it quiet. So moving toward getting a report that says for each of the 50 states, this is what's been done to follow SFFA and other legal rules, I think is an important thing to come out of this session.
Thank you, George. Are you suggesting that there should be maybe a national document that could guide state attorneys general? Is that what you just said?
Well, I think the first step is to find out what state attorney generals and boards are telling their campuses. In some states, it's quite public. No question about it. The state attorney generals have intervened, made public statements. Governors have made statements. Other states, it's either secret or they're not saying anything. And I think there needs to be a national report that says, this is what's going on in Arkansas, this is what's going on in Arizona, et cetera, for each state, so that we can see that there's a wide diversity in how states are complying with the law. And that, once we have that kind of evidence, then I think we can take action to create some pressure on those states that are treating this as confidential or some states that just haven't acted at all?
Yeah, that is a great idea. Actually, in Kentucky, a state legislator asked the state attorney general to issue a formal opinion on race-based practices in the Kentucky state schools. And the attorney general said race-based practices are no longer legal under Students for Fair Admission. But it's a great idea to have perhaps a compendium of all of those, as you say, to put pressure on some of the slacker states. I loved your point that these programs are not responses to real problems. On the contrary, these are sui sponte. They're on their own, as Scott was suggesting, a top-down remaking of morality or ethics. And what's interesting about these loyalty oaths is that they're such overt thought control. You know, thought control and image control is often through sneaky advertising, you know, the beautiful woman by the fancy car, or the entertainment industry with image creation. But these diversity loyalty oaths are unabashed, overt, brazen efforts at thought control from universities, no less, who historically stood for the freedom of thought and academic freedom. So we really have an egregious situation on our hands, and unbelievable. So on that note about what state attorneys generals can do, or perhaps other education officials, Ken Cuccinelli, former Virginia Attorney General, a lot of what the policy world does is issue reports such as these with major fact findings, raising not just political issues, but you know, this isn't just the right versus the left, conservative versus liberal, but as the Maryland report points out, constitutional and legal matters. So we want these reports in front of state legal officials, such as the state attorney general. Could you enlighten us, Ken, on what role the state attorney general can play? Is it limited to just the Kentucky attorney general issuing an opinion that the state schools, what is the dynamic there? Can you walk us through that?
So first of all, it will change from state to state, but moving from some of the reports that have been done here to the legal topic more purely, George makes the right hook, which is, and it came up in, it's more commonly SFFA, I call them the Harvard and UNC cases, recently from the Supreme Court, where the court said to utilize racism, you have to be fixing overt acts of racism. You can fix constitutional or statutory violations by methods that include favoring one race or group over another to remedy an actual recent, not 50 years ago, instance of institutional racism. And I read several of these reports in preparation. I am also noteworthy a graduate of the University of Virginia and George Mason. And Jay certainly accurately represented this very small oases of non-wildly communist thought at George Mason being econ and law, and that's it. Though even I was shocked about the ratio of diversity crats to faculty. But not a single one of the reports or the reports on which you are writing, for example, in Maryland's case,
Sorry, your mic's not on.
Speak to any recent or even alleged current racism that has to be fixed. I really liken this to just kind of a compliment to the worst part of the environmental movement. The old joke out of the 70s was green on the outside, red on the inside. And it was a very pleasant cover for communism, for government takeover of the economy and your lives and so forth. And this is virulent new piece of Marxism exercised in the real world. It's part of the anti-American piece of it, and that is that instead of class, they have put race in, and we're all to hate all of the other classes. That's what we're called to do. And here it's race versus race, and that's quite intentional, it's quite destructive, and it's quite illegal. The Maryland NAS, and by the way, for those of you unfamiliar, I've never seen a National Association of Scholars product that was not of just exceptional quality. Now, part of the reason I think that is these folks, you want to talk about a minority under the gun. These folks on their campuses are truly minorities under the gun, intellectual minorities. And so part of it may be they know that the skepticism and scrutiny they're going to get is 100 times what any of their left-wing colleagues would ever get. But in the iron sharpens iron category, they have responded and they produce really valuable intellectual and policy material. And I commend NAS. I appreciate Heritage having us here today. And I would note that the, what state attorneys general can do is pretty strong. And George was more polite than I might be. I worked with Doug Gansler when I didn't help him write his report 10 years ago, 11 years ago, I guess it is, 2013. Mm-hmm. But I worked with Doug, and there was no way, if Doug were the AG today, the advice they'd be giving is how to get around Harvard and UNC, not how to comply with Harvard and UNC. And you can bet that if, as and when you uncover that advice, that is what it will be for a lot of those extremely progressive attorneys general. They are not giving their clients advice of how to comply with what the Supreme Court says the Constitution calls for. I am quite confident they're giving their clients, quote, advice on how to try to avoid it. And as luck would have it, if you say the Supreme Court has made that very difficult to do. I've already explained to you the one exception. You have to be able to identify an overt violation of equal protection that needs to be fixed to use policies that go under the various names that Teresa walked through, most of them, of diversity, inclusion, reverse racism. All of these violate equal protection, all of them. Compelled speech was addressed not recently, but 80 years ago, before most of us were born, maybe all of us were born, by the Supreme Court. It is vehemently in opposition to the First Amendment. The results with respect to shaping faculties and student bodies are exactly as George describes. And what I find surprising is how infrequently, not never, but how infrequently relative to the occurrence of these policies, they're being challenged. I think that may pick up and that state AGs may play a role in that. For instance, my Virginia Attorney General, Jason Miara, is not so much at the university level, but with Thomas Jefferson High School, is very active in attempting to undo admissions policies there. But one of the points I want to make is this goes way beyond admissions. George made this as well. It's not just hiring. It's also tenure. It's also activities at the university themselves. And more importantly, for a societal perspective, people are being trained to hate on a race basis. And part of what they're being trained to hate is America itself. Prior to the Harvard and UNC cases, I think there was a lot of question because the previous cases out of 2003, the two Bollinger cases out of Michigan, one of them said, nope, race can't be the deciding factor in admissions. The other one said, but you can kind of take it into effect. And thank you for that clear guidance. And for 20 years, in the absence of that guidance, DEI, I like DIE myself, actually. DIE is a much better way to think of it, ran amok. And the Supreme Court has closed the door on it. They did that last year. Post-Harvard UNC
era. And I think we're just at the beginning of cleaning all of this out. And it isn't just budget, it isn't just the law. It's much bigger than that. It has a philosophical impact. State AGs have a significant role to play because they are officers who enforce the law.
Well, that's my question, though, for those states that are doing runarounds, and we need to wrap up because we're going to start the Q&A. Does that leave enforcement of a Supreme Court decision to lawsuits, to people challenging? Yes. I mean, that's fine for nonprofits and public interest law firms, but it's sort of unsatisfactory because lawsuits, first of all, take forever. They cost a lot of money, and you have to have, a nonprofit or a public interest law firm to do it. It's a lousy way to enforce the law of the land.
Well, if you compare the DEI effort in the corporate world, it's dying already.
That's true.
And it's dying because there is accountability. There is very little accountability in higher ed. If you went to the University of Virginia, they would consider themselves more a part of the institution of higher education than of the Commonwealth of Virginia. And you will find that across the country at these universities. In Texas, in yeehaw, I mean, the reddest of red states, they don't care. They don't care. And a lot of the reason they don't care is they are not held accountable even within those environments. Never. And it's not their money when they lose the lawsuit.
Right.
They're spending your money to afflict you, to tell you and your children why to hate America.
We're spending money defending the institution.
Even worse.
But we do need to go to Q&A. Scott, did you want to make a quick remark?
Just on that question, what the attorney generals can do. The Texas law, SB 17, passed a couple years ago, is actually an excellent model because it abolished DEI offices. There were consequences for continuing them of DEI employees in those offices, and the attorney general was charged with enforcing it, along with the boards of trustees. So expanding kind of the field of play so that you're not just talking about race-based admissions, but also race-based hiring, these offices, kinds of training, and then empowering AGs with the full scope of the law behind them is a way of putting universities on their back heels as opposed to waiting for private lawsuits.
Yes. Well, scrutiny, though, these reports already are something. Sunshine is a disinfectant. People are less comfortable when they know they are being watched. But real legal enforcement would be even better. Okay, so Katie, we want to open it up to the audience for questions, and I don't know if there's a microphone that is circulating. Okay, so why don't we start up here in the front?
Good morning. I know George addressed most of this, but I'm still confused as to how in administrative roles on college campuses and universities that these DEI police are even getting hired. What's to stop any sort of disruptive, crazy group from, pushing their agenda and getting hired in administrative roles? Who hires these people?
I think that's directed at George.
Well, different campuses have different sets of rules about hiring administrators, but basically they report technically to boards of regents or trustees, but in fact they have a great deal of autonomy, and they are being held. They're going through kind of a rough period right now. We've seen 3 Ivy League professors, presidents now have been dismissed because of their failure to defend intellectual freedom and free speech on their campuses and defend the safety of the campus, and failure to engage in debate and civil discourse about controversial issues. If I could just add one more point. A recent FIRE survey, the Foundation for Individual Rights of Free Expression, found that 3 in 5 US students said it was acceptable to shout down speakers to prevent them from even being heard on campus. Think about that. We now have a student generation that has absorbed the administrative and faculty's sense that certain kinds of things are so controversial they should never be heard. So when demonstrations erupted on American universities, universities did not have policies, did not have the defense mechanisms to protect freedom of speech and intellectual diversity. And DEI has had a lot to do with the collapsing of those defenses.
You know, I think it was 1989 that Roger Kimball wrote Tenured Radicals. So the radicalization of higher education has been in place for a long, long time. And they are doing the hiring. So that's sort of a short way of looking at it. They are running the show. And that's a big part of the problem. Yes, over here, the man in black.
Thank you. Oh, sorry. Nigel Ashford, Institute for Humane Studies. What policies can we encourage state governments to pursue to curb DEI that will not then be used by Democrats to curb conservative activities on campus?
Well, my pet peeve and my interest is actually taking a page from Title IX that the schools, on condition of receiving both state or federal funding, it doesn't matter, must certify annually to the General Assembly that they are cutting DEI out. So it's a certificate of compliance. The reason I advocate that approach is because litigation puts all the onus on the complainant. The institution can sit back and litigate for days or decades. As Ken points out, the institution it has taxpayer funding. Taxpayer funding pays the institution's lawyer. So this is asymmetric warfare. The complainant is always at an extreme disadvantage and shoulders, of course, the burden of proof. Whereas requiring a certificate be filed with the General Assembly under oath, notarized like an affidavit, that makes one person accountable. We've said a lot of the problem is a lack of accountability. But if one person has to put his or her name on an affidavit like that, a certificate, to say that DEI is being cut and can be called before the General Assembly, you shift the balance so that the onus is on the schools to say that they are doing something about this deep state within the colleges and universities.
Can I suggest two practical things? Because I recognize your concern about how it might interfere with academic freedom if we have a counter-orthodoxy imposed by a state legislature. And first, the laws that abolish DEI bureaucracies don't interfere with intellectual freedom, academic freedom at all, because those units are not engaged in teaching or research. Those units are there to articulate and enforce an official ideology of the university, okay, on contentious matters of race, ethnicity, and sexual identity. And so state laws have forbidden those bureaucracies in Texas, in Florida, Iowa. So we can have state legislatures abolish those bureaucracies. Then as far as the kind of gender ethnic studies, the grievance departments, right? Those, how do you get rid of those? And the way to get rid of those is to starve the beast of money. So those are all creations of excess money in higher education. They don't generate grants very well, okay? And they don't have very many students because good luck finding a job, right? So they're not that intellectually interesting. They don't have a long intellectual tradition to learn. So these are heavily subsidized units within the university, which university bureaucrats do because they have a lot of excess money to indulge these departments, and they do it because they're trying to move up an academic hierarchy. So the way to get a better administrative job at another university is to support the creation of these units, is to expand them. It's a way to stave off protests from students. You appease the angry students by saying, I'm going to create a department to address that grievance. These are all smart things to do if you're a bureaucrat with other people's money. But if there isn't as much other people's money around, then you can't do it as well. And as the money gets tight, the departments that get eliminated first will be these grievance studies departments. The gender, ethnic studies things will go away sooner. So it forces the accountability of universities making choices about what's really central to their academic mission and what's not, and they will make the choices, and you won't have to from the state legislature about which departments to get rid of.
Somewhat related, boards of regents are often required by law to be balanced politically. And if the vision is on balance at the university, or intellectual diversity, as George puts it, that should be the eyes on the prize, that you don't want the grotesque imbalance of politicization that we have right now. Yes, that back row there.
When I worked for Mayor Giuliani, I had, as commissioner, I had 17,000 employees. If I were told I had to run a DEI system, I don't know what instructions I would give to the staff to administer DEI. So my question is the following: how do DEI administrators occupy 8 hours a day?
You should look at their job titles. I mean, it's like a word salad.
Yeah, if I may, we say it about children all the time, idle hands make the devil's work. They do. And it's true for adults as well, especially for people who come in with what, from our perspective, is malicious intent, malicious in the sense of contrary to the law and the Constitution. And they fill it up. They go investigate the Scotts of the world. Gosh, I've been here a month, I don't have much to do. Well, this guy's a troublemaker, so let's go run this to ground. It's not in my job description, or maybe it is, and I can interpret it that way, and off they go. And so it's awfully hard for them to come up with 8 hours a day of work that is actually constructive. And so, in my view, they end up doing things that are quite destructive, and by the way, that expand the liability of the university, having been the counsel to all of these universities in Virginia. Wayward employees can cause you an awful lot of legal trouble. And they don't feel particularly held to account, which means they can be very arbitrary, very capricious, way beyond even what you would think of as your usual bad case scenarios from a risk management standpoint. All in the constitutional space, not just, gee, are we complying with these federal appropriations rules, but really violating people's constitutional rights, and many of them having no notion that they're doing so.
Cancer cells are not productive either, but they're very busy, and they metastasize throughout a body and can be fatal. And I think that's what we're dealing with here if we don't excise these malignancies. And
just 1 second. Overseeing all the hiring at a university, every aspect of the hiring, what your job description is, where you're going to advertise for those jobs, what the pool is, how the pool is composed, whether or not it's adequately diverse and equitable, what the interviews are like, all the training that each member of the faculty must receive in order to serve on a search committee.
right.
All of that is what, that's like a sliver of what diversity, equity, inclusion bureaucrats do. So, I mean, that's how you can get 500. Because as you do more hiring, even for diversity bureaucrats, I suppose, you have that entire process set up. The job of making an inclusive university is endless. Because any aggrieved minority can have a claim against this environment doesn't feel inclusive enough. Every syllabus could be analyzed. Every lecture could be analyzed. The student experience must be evaluated and constantly updated for adequate inclusivity. Obviously, dissenters would be crushed in some way, but also like lots of supportive student support, anti-suicide, anti-bigotry endeavors, placards must be placed everywhere. So because the job of building an equitable university and an inclusive university are in principle endless, the number of bureaucrats needed to build that bureaucracy and that new university are in principle endless.
And it's in their interest to find more problems to solve.
Totally.
And the irony, of course, is that the hostility, given the phrases toxic masculinity, white privilege, white fragility, all of the hostility really is directed toward not these groups that claim to be marginalized. So we are running out of time, so that was the last question. I want to thank so profusely all my panel members. What a good discussion and what good reports as a foundation. And we will continue into the second hour with a more in-depth policy discussion, I think, after lunch for us. But thank you to the attendees. I hope you found it as productive as I did. Thank you.